When I was in ninth grade, I took a course entitled Public Speaking and Argumentation. It was a course that was a pathway towards being a member of the speech and/or debate team. My teacher broke down argumentation into three parts: the logos, the ethos, and the pathos. The logos was the actual structure and content of an argument. It was the pure reason and facts. The ethos was the rules of proper conduct in a given discourse, and the pathos was the presentation of the argument. This includes everything from the emotional content to rhetorical devices employed. Though an oversimplification, that lesson taught me a lot about how to argue effectively. More importantly, it taught me how to spot a dishonest argument. This video series is going to deconstruct the pathos of apologetics by pointing out the ways in which apologists use rhetorical trickery to get their points across. I want to be clear that this is not a comprehensive refutation of any argument. It is simply a deconstruction of rhetoric common to apologetic arguments. It is my belief that the more honest and accurate an argument is, the less rhetorical flair it requires. Before I begin this video, I want to give two shoutouts. The first is to Suicide for Celluloid for his video series, Apologetics as an Ideology. This series was a partial inspiration for my own series, and he has a very different take on counter-apologetics than most atheists on YouTube. It's refreshing and enlightening to see a different perspective. The second shout-out I want to give is to The Polymath. His videos debunking IP's nonsense are both well-made and informative. He is criminally undersubscribed, and I think that should be remedied. As many of you know, I'm a graduate student in biology. In May, I will receive my master's, and in August, I will begin my PhD at a top research university. I have an undergraduate degree in both biology and computer science and have conducted research for more than half a decade. For all that I've accomplished in my short time in academia, I must confess that I'm not an expert. Expertise in any subject requires years of training and a PhD. Until that point, I may be an expert in my own research, but I cannot speak for my field as a whole. One of the most valuable experiences I've had whilst conducting research is the realization that I'm an intellectual infant compared to a whole slew of practicing scientists. There is a reason that the phrase "standing on the shoulders of giants" is so apt in describing how knowledge progresses in the world of academic science. The beautiful thing about science is that if you make a methodological mistake, people jump down your throat for it. You better think through your experiments and presentations, or else you won't have a pleasant time. It is truly a trial by fire. Our first rhetorical trick, misrepresentation of a scientific field, is perhaps the most annoying and devious of all of them in this series. The best example of this trick being employed is creationism. Many creationists will pretend that there is a legitimate controversy among scientists as to whether the mainstream picture of Darwinian evolution is the case. The best example is the recent debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, wherein Ken Ham constantly cited scientists who agreed with him, whilst neglecting the fact that most scientists disagree with him.
I also mentioned Dr. Raymond Damadian, who actually invented the MRI scanner. I want you to meet a biblical creationist who is a scientist and inventor. Let me introduce you to another biblical creation scientist.
My name is Danny Faulkner.
I also mentioned Dr. Stuart Burgess, Professor of Engineering Design at Bristol University in England. Let me introduce you to another biblical creationist who is a scientist.
What Ken Ham fails to note is the fact that the scientists that he cites are the exception and not the rule. The best numbers that I can find on scientists who do not accept evolution are from the Discovery Institute's petition, A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism, which is displayed on the screen. As of its last update, this petition had a meager 768 signatures, many of whom were not biologists. Further, the National Center for Science Education put out a parody counter-petition called Project Steve, wherein scientists named Steve, or any derivative of the name such as Stephen, Stephanie, etc., who accepted evolution, could sign. As of February 17th, the petition had 1,324 signatures. That's right, a troll petition got almost twice as many signatures. To really drive the point home, I took a look at the National Science Foundation's figures on the number of working PhD scientists. There are approximately 506,000 PhD scientists working, including about 164,000 biological scientists. The fact that a meager 761 publicly dissent from Darwinism should indicate how rare of an opinion creationism really is. However, this rhetorical trick is most devious when employed in areas of controversy in science. The best example of this is inspiring philosophy, hereafter referred to as IP, and Johann Ratz's preaching of quantum woo with the aim of proving subjective idealism. Subjective idealism is the position that the universe is mental in nature rather than physical, and only minds exist rather than anything material. IP and Ratz try to use quantum physics to justify this position. They end up looking like Deepak Chopra with all of the woo but none of the charisma. Before I deconstruct the dishonesty of IP and Ratz, I want to make one thing extremely clear. I am not a physicist. I have very little formal training in physics, and thus my opinion has very little authority. When we deal with the subject of the foundations of quantum theory, we are dealing with a highly controversial field where PhD scientists can hardly agree upon the fundamental questions. So you shouldn't take my word at face value and check everything I say for yourself, as I cannot claim to speak for the field in question. A year ago, 3 physicists took a poll at a conference on quantum foundations. This graph is taken from that poll, which you can find linked below. As you can see, there is far from a consensus on which interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct. The Copenhagen interpretation, which is the favorite of Ratz and IP, has a relatively small plurality at 42%, but 12% of the physicists polled, and remember, these are the experts, had no preferred interpretation. That's right, 12% of the experts did not prefer one interpretation over the others. Why IP and Ratz do not mention these facts is beyond me, but it does say something about their honesty considering the fact that neither of them is an expert in this subject, nor have they done any academic research in the field. It would behoove them to actually be honest about the state of quantum mechanics if they want to have a serious discussion. Instead, IP and Ratz flagellate that quantum physics debunks materialism without a shred of indication that there is a serious disagreement regarding the issue that they are addressing. This same poll asked other questions that are germane to the arguments of these two woo merchants. One of the main points of their arguments is the observer effect. Here is a clip from the Polymath's epic takedown of IP's video explaining this phenomenon.
However, the equations of quantum mechanics and the results of the double-slit experiment change that. To understand what this experiment showed, a simple explanation is given. Subatomic particles were thought to exist like tiny bits of matter, not like continuous waves of energy. However, sending electrons through a double slit showed they acted like waves of energy instead of tiny bits of matter. Even sending one electron through at a time, the same results happened. However, when one set up a measuring device at one slit, the results changed, and the electrons acted as one would expect, as tiny bits and not spread out waves.
When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of 2 bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched.
While IP did describe the double-slit experiment fairly for the most part, the part on which many people get lost is what is meant by an observer. You see, as a matter of physics, it cannot be a human observer, as our eyes are not sensitive enough to see the low-intensity light that is frequently dealt with in these types of experiments. Moreover, the wavelengths used are far from visible. You have to understand that IP relies on these fringe science quacks to produce these videos. His Dr. Quantum videos are produced by physicist Fred Alan Wolf. Wolf is a fringe physicist whose quantum consciousness ideas have been featured in both The Secret and What the Bleep Do We Know, just to give you a matter of perspective. Unlike IP, I will actually tell you what is meant by an observer in regards to this experiment. You see, the classical picture of light is as a continuous wave that moves in the air, or in a vacuum. On the classical picture, when light passes through a slit, it forms cylindrical waves, and then it passes through 2 narrow slits and disperses into an interference pattern on the screen. However, it does get interesting when one discusses the act of observation, and here's usually where people are led astray. Now understand that the classical picture of light still manifests itself even when dealing with just one single photon at a time, which was puzzling to physicists. So they decided to make an observation. In these types of experiments, observation is done by a detector, usually in the form of a photomultiplier tube, not a human being. A photomultiplier is a class of vacuum tube that is made to detect very low intensity ranges of the electromagnetic spectrum. The photodetector must interact with the photon in order to know the slit through which it went. The first stage of the interaction is when the photon collides with the photocathode material. Through the photoelectric effect, this collision produces electrons that are then multiplied by a process known as secondary electron emission. During the process of secondary emission, electrons are sent to an electrode called a dynode, where they collide to create new electrons. This process iterates itself and builds up until the last dynode is reached, at which a very powerful pulse of electric current is generated, signaling the arrival of the first photon. Where in this explanation did I need to invoke the idea that the consciousness of a living organism changes the photon? Nowhere, because I didn't have to.
If it isn't clear from that clip, IP and rats believe that the observer effect is caused by the presence of a conscious observer. Using experiments in physics, they try to argue that the conscious observers create reality. This gives consciousness a special role in the universe, and one can see how this would lead to their brand of idealism. However, as Polymath explains, there is no need to invoke consciousness in order to explain what observation entails. Further, the physicists vociferously disagree with their position. This graph is taken from the same poll that I cited before. Only 6% of physicists agree that the observer has to be conscious. The authors of the same poll concluded that the Copenhagen interpretation does not imply that there is a role for conscious observation. It is important to note that one of the authors is Anton Zeilinger, from whom IP and rats borrow much of their arguments. Are they misquoting or misrepresenting him? I'll let you decide that one. But one thing is abundantly clear. These two chuckleheads are blatantly misrepresenting the position of an entire field. IP and rats are taking strong positions on both the proper interpretation of quantum mechanics and the observer effect. There is no consensus on the former, and they are in conflict with the consensus on the latter. Even on the question of whether physical objects have their properties well defined prior to and independent of observation, essentially a question that asks whether IP and rats are incorrect, physicists are sharply divided, as shown in this graph. Yet I find no hint of this in their rhetoric. Instead, they present their positions as if there was no controversy at all. I won't blame IP, because he obviously has no training in any formal scientific discipline, and gets all of his arguments on the topic from rats. Rats has a bachelor's degree in physics, and should know better than to omit the fact that he is taking some very controversial stances that can be plausibly rejected in favor of other similarly controversial stances, or simply the mainstream position. He should also know that his view on the observer effect is a fringe view and not representative of the current opinion among experts. However, that would weaken his rhetoric, and this is a series about rhetorical tricks. As someone who has spent quite some time as a research scientist and who looks forward to spending the rest of his life in his chosen field, I find this highly disturbing. Science does not work by inventing controversy in the case of Ken Ham, or omitting it in the case of IP and rats. The purpose of this rhetorical trick is to reduce the effectiveness of the scientific system in order to inject their God into the debate. You should always be wary of such attempts and make sure to check the current status of the field in question prior to accepting someone's argument. Stay tuned for part 2.